Right, like last time, I do have some slides. So I'm going to try and screen share. Preparing for the future, warnings from Lot. Last time, hang on. Last time we looked at Noah and how lessons he taught us and how he was ready for the flood when it came and lots of people were not. 4 things we learned, I suggested we could learn from Noah last time, was that he desired righteousness, he recognized the Lord's voice, he obeyed the Lord's voice, and he proclaimed God's righteousness. When we come to Lot, it's a different story. Jesus referred to Lot in Luke immediately after referring to Noah. And in Luke 17, there's a passage where he says, it was the same in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so it will be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So there's something there. Jesus carried on though and said this. In that day, he was on the housetop and his goods were in the house. Let him not come down to take them away. And likewise, the one who is in the field, let him not turn back. And if you know the passage, you'll know there's a phrase missing here, which Jesus goes on to say, remember Lot's wife. So one of the questions I want us to think about tonight is, why did Jesus talk about not going back into the house when he comes back in the context of Lot's wife? We'll move on to that later, but that's the seed I want to sow in your mind. Secondly, the other place in the New Testament where Lot is mentioned is in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. I'm not going to read all these, I'm just going to try and summarize some of them. Peter is talking about false prophets and people who will bring swift destruction upon themselves. And others will follow them in sensuality. They'll use false words. And he's talking about that destruction is coming, it's not asleep. And then he says, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example of those who would live ungodly thereafter, and if he rescued Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men. All right, let's pause and see that. Here we have the city of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed, but he's rescuing righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the conduct of unprincipled men. So while Lot was living in Sodom, he wasn't very comfortable. He felt oppressed. And perhaps that's something we can recognize more and more in our society as Christians. We feel oppressed by the atmosphere that is happening. And he explains it further, does Peter. He says, for by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day with the lawless deed, with their lawless deeds. So Lot was very uncomfortable in Sodom. And then Peter's point is, if he could rescue Lot, he's going to rescue you. Don't worry. All these he rescued Noah, he rescued Lot, he can rescue you. So what can we learn from the life of Lot? A little bit of background is he first appears in Genesis 11, and he's the grandson of Terah. His dad is Haran, who dies between verses 27 and 31, and his uncle are Abram and Nahor. And Terah in verse 31 has been told to leave, and he sets off, and he takes Abram and Lot with him, and several other people. But they only get as far as the city of Haran, and they stop there. They don't get all the way. At the start of chapter 12, Terah dies, and God says to Abram, it's time for you to move and get to Canaan. And in verse 4, we discover that Lot went with him. And verse 5, we discover all that Abram took on the journey, including Lot. Now we have to slow down a bit, because here we get to more details. But first of all, notice that between this, there had been a famine in Canaan, and Abram had gone down to Egypt. We don't get told that Lot went with him. We just get told that Abram and Sarai went down there. But in verse 5 and 9 of chapter 13, 5 to 9, we discover that Lot, first of all, had many possessions. And when he came back to Canaan with Abram, there wasn't enough space for them. They had so much possessions between them, and arguments broke out between Abraham and the herdsmen. Now, Abraham didn't want there to be arguments, so he asked Lot to go his separate way. He said, I feel like he said to him, you've been following me around long enough, Lot. Go and make it a life for yourself. But to help him, he said, you can choose. Wherever you go, I'll go in the opposite direction. So in verses 10 to 13, we read this. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. And then we read, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Okay, folks, it's time for you to come in here, because I want to ask you, what do you think about Lot's choice? I'm going to stop my screen share and hopefully I'll be able to see most of you. So the question is, who has any thoughts about Lot's choice of going to Sodom? Do we think it was a good choice? Is it a choice you would have made? You'll have to mute yourselves to contribute, but come on, Sunday. I need feedback. Come on, Philip. You get the ball rolling.
I just wanted to point out that there's a misconception that Israel back then was pretty much like Israel today, because I think some translations wrongly use the word desert for wilderness. Wilderness is not desert. And if they went into a land flowing with milk and honey, and there were very fertile plains, etc., it was obviously nothing like Israel today. And that's the first point that I would make. And obviously a lot of the problems with Sodom and Gomorrah were much worsened after God's judgment upon it, and then it's become an area, a very, very arid area, etc.
Yeah.
I mean, it always sounds to me as the description that's given of the Jordan Valley sounds like the natural choice, doesn't it, of looking at the fertile plain.
Mm.
So it sounds a natural thing for Lot to choose to go that way.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, nowadays I've done a lot of bird watching and walking in the Arabah between the Dead Sea and Eilat. Well, I've done a bit, and there's no river or water there at all now, from the Dead Sea all the way down to Eilat, none whatsoever. So it's obviously changed hugely.
Yeah, but that isn't the choice that Lot was making. He could see it was indeed the easy place to live.
Yeah.
But what about the choice he made with the fact that he knew this city was there?
Oh, he might not.
Where it wasn't good. Wendy, you wanted to come in?
I just think it's a selfish decision that he could have offered his uncle, the better place to go. And he doesn't necessarily know about Sodom, does he, till he gets there? I don't know.
No.
It's unsure, but they had lived there for a while and they'd come back. And I presume that there was people travelling around and news travelled.
Yes, you'd assume that was known about and its reputation wouldn't. So that what you're saying, there'd be enough trade and interaction going on that you would know about.
I think we tend to think because they didn't have mobile phones and things like that, news didn't travel. But human society, news travels, and I think they would have known enough about it because, well, we'll come to it later. But when Sodom is defeated, Abram's up somewhere in the mountain and news gets to him. So news travels.
Yes.
Can I just say that the beginning of Genesis 13 does seem to say that Lot was with Abram in Egypt. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him.
Yeah, I'm saying we don't get told that he goes down to Egypt. He's not mentioned when Abram goes down, but we get told that he comes up out of Egypt. So the point is he followed Abram. He went with Abram down there. Right?
Yeah.
I think just to pick up on Wendy's point, I'd almost say he was being lazy where he chose to go.
Just what I was going to say.
Yeah. Sorry, Christine. Say more.
I was just going to say that it was a lazy choice. That's how I see Lot. He took the easy way, the broad way.
Yeah.
The way that led to destruction in the end for all the people down in that valley.
Yeah. That I've not made the connection between the narrow and the broad way, but I think that's exactly what he was doing. He was taking the broad way.
But are we being too judgmental? And that's probably the wrong word. But the land could support the herds of sheep, the flocks of sheep. There was plenty to feed. It wasn't as though it was barren. it supported livestock.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily a black and white choice. It might be marginally better, more water, but nevertheless it's a viable land.
Oh, well, it was viable land, but Abraham was ready in return to go to the difficult areas because
yes,
he lived up in the mountains.
yes.
It was much harder for Abraham in that sense. I'm getting us to think through Lot's character. One thing I want to say, I may have said it last time. For me, the Bible is a book about two natures. It's about divine nature and it's about human nature. And all of human life is in there. And what we can learn is how divine nature and human nature relates. And so I'm trying to first build up a bigger picture of the choices Lot made so we can understand where he's coming from in that sense and see where he ends up. Yeah.
But you're not saying that Abraham had a divine nature.
I would say that his heart was in a better place than Lot's.
Yes.
I'm saying that,
but not divine.
No. I'm saying that Abraham is somebody else with a human nature, but his heart was in a better place in his relationship with God. Georgina, it looks like you want to come in.
Are we giving Lot false notice here? Perhaps he knew that Sodom was a more wicked place than he'd been used to, living with this people that he knew well. And maybe he was going to take his righteousness with him to show people of Sodom a different way. I'm trying to be generous to him rather than calling him lazy.
Yeah. It doesn't say that.
It doesn't, no. It doesn't say he was lazy either.
So, the one thing that it points out in the text is he was going to a very wicked place. So he may have had a missionary mind, and maybe we'll explore that a bit later, not in those words, but we'll explore some of it. Yeah. Anybody else, or shall we go back? Having heard about Lot's choice here, anybody want to come in before we go back to the screen share? We're now at this place where Lot's separated, and I want to point out what God says to Abraham immediately afterwards. He doesn't say you've messed it up. He says, lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are in every direction, because everything you can see I'm going to give to you and your descendants forever. So, and he goes on, and we know it, I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so nobody can number them. And then he says, arise and walk in the land through its length and its width, for I will give it to you. And then we're told he moved his tent to live somewhere else. But there's a word in this passage I want to highlight. And I felt it is a word that God brought me to in the respect of this. There in the middle, he says to Abraham, arise, walk in the land through its length and its width. Now, the Hebrew word used is halak, and it's Strong's 1980. But it means many things. It talks about the river walking in that sense, moving. But specifically, the first time it gets used in the scriptures is in Genesis 3:8, when the Lord God walked in the garden in the cool of the day. It occurs again twice about Enoch, who walked with God. And eventually God said, I enjoy these talks so much, why don't you come home with me? We read of Noah walking with God. But Philip took us back to chapter 13, verse 5. Well, the word there, when it says Lot also, who went with Abram, it's actually the same word. He walked with Abram, his flocks and his herds and his tents. But that's the only person we hear of Lot walking with, is Abram. Later we hear of God telling Abram to walk before him and be blameless. When Jacob fled, he said, if God will be with me and keep me in the way that I am walking. In Leviticus, God says to the people, I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. And in Deuteronomy, the Lord your God who walks before you. And the Lord your God who walks in the midst of your camp. And more. You see, this word does talk about a relationship with God. We need to walk in his ways, and he will walk with us. And so my first suggestion, and you may want to come back to me later, is this. You may think I'm being a bit cruel, but it seemed to me the first warning I want to give you from the life of Lot is he's never commended for walking with God. And we only hear about him walking with men. So who are we content to walk with? Do we want to walk with other people? Or are we more concerned to walk with God? So that's my first warning. We might want to walk with people who are walking with God, as Lot did, but it's not the same as learning to walk with God ourselves. It's a second best place. I want to move on. We're coming to another discussion soon. In Genesis 14, we meet Lot again, but it's not in good circumstances. In this, excuse me, in this valley where he'd gone to live, there were 5 kings. 2 of them, the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, all of them rebelled against their overlords. And I'm not going. There's so much in that chapter. I'm not going into it all. I'm focusing on Lot. But when they rebelled, we find out the outcome in verse 10 that in the valley of Sodom they were defeated, and the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. But then we also read that they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So because he was in this place, Lot got captured. And news of Lot's predicament reached Abram, and he gets his men together, he goes after them, and he defeats the captors. This is one man. When 5 kings hadn't been able to stand them, he defeats the captors, rescues Lot, and all the people from these cities. Now, the reason most of us know about chapter 14 of Genesis is because after he's done this, Abram encounters Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and who is identified in Hebrews 7 as a type of Christ, of Jesus. Also at that time, the king of Sodom offers Abram all the wealth of the city that he's taken back, but he refuses to keep it, only asking for a share for those who fought with him and for what they'd eaten. There is no other mention of Lot in this chapter. So the only mention is he got captured, and Lot and Abram rescued him along with everybody else. So, another point. How relevant do you think these events are to Lot's future. The events of this chapter, how relevant do you think they are to Lot's future? So I'm going to stop my screen share there and another time for some discussion. Anybody got any thoughts? Have you ever thought of that question before? You'll have to mute yourselves if you haven't already done so, if you want to contribute.
Certain action that I have a thought, so I would do some thinking. Just before you stop sharing just now, I did start to answer the first question, but realizing that I haven't unmuted myself.
Right.
So I'll just say it does. What's the word? Like what you said about the warning. It's about we had the benefit of hindsight where he ended up at, and because we had the benefit of hindsight knowing the story to know that he, if like got mixed in with the wrong crowd, so we say, and then get bad influence. So with the benefit of hindsight, yes, it wasn't a good choice, but the warning definitely is how we walk, or who do we walk with, and that with us. So sorry, I don't have answer to the second question.
That's all right.
Okay.
Yes, Philip. Unmute.
It is now unmuted, yeah. My answer is more about the first question, but it's also relevant that because it made me think of, because we are working in the old and the new, it made me think of Revelation, where we have people in what we can loosely call Babylon the Great, the world empire of false religion, however you want to look at that. Right up until the very end, God is telling them, come out of Babylon, my people. And so we have a lot of people nowadays in various dodgy churches and what have you, who think that they need to stay in to try and influence the people in there. So I was wondering if this Lot could have been imagining that he would be a refining influence on the people of Sodom. I mean, it doesn't say anything about that. But he was troubled, we went into earlier about how he was troubled at living in these people, with these ungodly people. You know, could that be part of it?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. Christine.
I saw Lot in that passage as one of the weaker brethren who need a stronger person to rescue them. I think that's the main thing. Abraham was the one who walked with God and knew God, and Lot hadn't got there yet.
Right.
He needed rescuing and refining. And we see later that he needed rescuing even later on in his life. But sometimes we are given the privilege of helping someone along the road and showing them the truth. I think that's what, I can't remember who did it to Apollos, but there is an example in the New Testament, isn't there?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't it often adversity brings us to our senses? It's a lesson we all have to learn from not from other people, but for our own, in our own. As somebody said, God doesn't have any grandchildren. Each generation has to learn directly. It's not as though your grandparents can teach you. Adversity is the rebukes and correcting is the Lord's way.
Yeah.
I think to go.
I agree with you there, Roy, that It is. Psalm 107 is the classic passage for me where God brings adversity on people. I'm not going to go into it, it's a long one. But I think we also have to say that adversity can do that, but it doesn't always. People do not always learn from their mistakes.
Well, yes, the point is that Lot didn't learn. He went back to live in Sodom. You know.
Yeah, well, I think that's the point, isn't it? We said earlier, did he know what the people of Sodom were like when he first went there?
Mm.
At this point, he definitely knew what the people of Sodom were like.
Yeah.
And he'd seen that they were not able to defend themselves.
Mm.
And yet one man was able to rescue him.
Mm.
I think there was a message here for him in that.
Mm.
Anybody else? Because I'm going to move us on if not.
Well, you say one man, Abram, but he obviously was strong enough and respected enough to be able to take men with him, and that those who.
Yeah, I think he had. We often think of him as the nuclear family moving around. He wasn't. He was a big business.
Yeah.
Mm.
You know, he was a nomadic tribal leader almost. 300 men, I think Mary thinks he had.
It says 318, doesn't it? Trained men born in his household.
Yeah, so it's quite a big business he's running.
Yes.
You know, and so, but he wasn't a king. You know, here we have 5 kings of 5 cities, and they were defeated.
Yeah.
But because God was with him, he succeeded. And that's the message that should have got across to Lot, I feel. Shall we carry on then? So, my next warning is when the Lord provides a way out, we ought to take it.
Yes.
That is a hard lesson to learn sometimes, but if God gives you an escape route, take it. Lot didn't. So we're going to move on because the next time we come across him is in chapter 19, but chapter 18 is well known because that's when God comes to Abraham by now and tells him he's going to, it's time for Sarah to give birth. And then he says, we're going down to Sodom to destroy it. And Abraham begins to intercede. So I'm going to give you a poll. And if I can find out how to do this while I'm screen sharing, here's a poll for you folks. Okay, I will take the rest of you out of it. I'll share the results. Yes, most people have gone with the righteous. Yep, you've seen that. And we shut that down, we stop the poll, and we go back to the screen share. We're on, and yeah, it was the righteous that he prays for. He says, and Abram came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? And we know the story. He started with a large number and it kept getting down until we got to the point in verse 32 where Abram said, let not the Lord be angry, and I'll speak just once more. Suppose only 10 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. But notice this, God didn't hang around to see if Abram was going to try to get it down to 5. At that point, so the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abram, and Abram returned to his place. But while it was the righteous, I think at the top of his list of the righteous would have been Lot. And he was concerned for Lot. He knew he was righteous, but he knew he wasn't wise either. And he knew that his character wasn't as strong as it should have been. And as I said there, it appears to me that Abram was praying for the righteous, but at the top of the list was Lot. Let's have a look at what happens next. Two of the 3 angels go into Sodom, and Lot invites them to stay with him. I'm sure we all know that men of all ages then start hammering on Lot's door, demanding that he sends the men out so they can have sex with them. Instead, Lot offers his 2 unmarried daughters as alternatives. But the people reject this trade. And here's a key point for some of the things we were saying earlier. They also reject him. In verse 9, it tells us this one came to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. So the people hate Lot. They didn't welcome whatever he kept saying to them. They turned them against him. And even if he was trying to reach them, it seems to have had the opposite effect. Threatening Lot, the angels reach out and pull him back into the house and then strike the attackers with blindness. The next thing that happens, 12 to 14, is that the angel asked Lot if he's any relatives who he needed to warn to leave before they destroy the city. Lot goes to tell his son-in-laws, but we read that they didn't take him seriously. They thought he was joking. And then in the morning, Lot is told to escape quickly before he and his family get caught up in the judgment. But can you remember what we read in the next verse? But he lingered. In fact, it actually said, and while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, and the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. It's only recently that I've realized why God had to send 2 angels into the city. One angel could have announced the destruction. One angel could have protected Lot's household when the men threatened to attack. But it needed 2 angels so they could get hold of 4 people's hands to drag them out of the city. And this is a warning we need to take from Lot. When God said go, he lingered. We will need to think later why he lingered. But he hadn't learnt at that point. When the angels had brought them outside the city, they said to them, escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest you be destroyed. Did Lot take notice? I'm afraid not. Lot said to them, please, no, my lord. Indeed, now your servant has found favour in your sight. and you've increased your mercy, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. What was he thinking of? God had just got him out of a disaster. Right. God had just got him out of a disaster. Couldn't God keep him safe till he got to the mountains? But Lot couldn't make the effort. Instead, he said, look, see now, this city is near enough to flee to. And it is a little one. It's not like that big town Sodom where all that trouble was. Please let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. God said, get out of the city, get out the plain. And Lot said, oh, I can't get up to the mountains, it's too hard. So he said to the angel, and he said, see, I have favoured you concerning this thing also, and I will not overthrow that city for which you have spoken. And he allowed him to go to Zoar. The name means little. But it was morning by the time Lot reached Zoar. But then we read his wife didn't make it because she looked back behind him and she turned to a pillar of salt. So the questions we're faced with is, why did Lot's wife look back? Why did Lot linger? Why was it so difficult for them to leave the city? Now, I believe that Scripture, when it gives us hard questions, if you look, you can find the answer. I don't think you have to speculate. And so in this sense, I think we know something here. And my suggestion is this, that in verse 14, which we looked at earlier, in the New King James Version, it reads, so Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-laws who had married his daughters. It's rather confused though, because a lot of other translations, including one of my favourites, the New American Standard Bible, puts it slightly different. He went out and spoke to his son-in-laws who were to marry his daughters. Is there confusion here? Which is it? Did he have daughters who were already married, plus the two who had not known men who were living at home? Or did he have only two daughters who were engaged and he left the son-in-laws behind? And I think this is an important question to answer. Unfortunately, the Hebrew appears to offer very little help, as it's the context which supplies the tense rather than the words. So the words used, and I'm not going to try and read the Hebrew, they are there on the right of Strong's numbers if you want to look them up. And like last time, I will be making these PowerPoints available if you want to download them to check. But sons-in-law simply means a relative by marriage. Married means to take. Daughters, yeah, means a daughter. So we don't get much help from the words, but a thought struck me, and so I went looking. Is there a word in the Bible that is used for betrothed, for engaged? And yes, there's several words used, but the one that is most common is this one, aras. It's translated 10 times in the King James Version as betrothed and one as a spouse. One of those appears in Exodus, 6 of them in Deuteronomy. The other 2 are there for completeness. My point is this: these first 5 books were all edited at least by Moses. If Moses wanted to say that the son-in-laws were future son-in-laws, that Lot's daughters were engaged, they were betrothed, he had a word that he could have used. He could have said who were betrothed to his daughters, but he chose a word that's commonly translated married. There is another problem though. A possible objection to that comes at the end of chapter 19, where Lot's 2 daughters are described as the firstborn and the younger. And I can see how to some people that might suggest that these 2 are the only 2 daughters that Lot had, but that is not necessarily the case. It could simply mean the older one and the younger one. The Hebrew word here is only used of females. It is not used of males. So it could simply mean the older daughter and the younger one. Or it could be that the eldest daughter and one of her younger sisters survived and others were still in the city. You may want to talk about that. I'm not going into it much deeper, apart from to point out one thing. There's a similar comparison in 2 of the families. You remember when Jacob had worked for Laban and he ended up with the wrong wife? Laban said to him, I couldn't have done it that way round, because in our country, you never give the younger daughter before the firstborn to be married. So that's one case. It also appears in 1 Samuel, where the sons of Saul are listed, and the names of his 2 daughters were these: the name of the firstborn, Merab, and the name of the younger, Michal. Now, we know there that these 2 women had brothers, and they had many. In fact, there's others. In 2 Samuel, there's a list of other half-brothers that they had. It is also true that Rebecca and Leah had brothers. We find that in Genesis 31, that when Jacob had been manipulating the sheep, so he got most of them by putting branches in their drinking troughs, he got word that the sons of Laban were upset and angry, and he decided it was time to leave. Now, in both those family cases, we have no information as to where the daughters came age-wise with their brothers. So that's just the evidence. I feel very clearly that this explains the fact that there was children, at least 2 daughters and perhaps grandchildren, left behind in Sodom being destroyed, that motivated Lot's wife to look back. Could well be why Lot lingered. It could be why he didn't want to go that far away, so he might go back and rescue them. And I feel that makes most sense of Jesus' warning in Luke 17, don't go back. He doesn't talk about children, but he says, don't go back. When you see me coming, come towards me. Now, I'm sure you'll want to discuss that possibility, and I'm going to give you a chance, but not straight away. But my third warning is don't become settled in a sinful society. As we saw, the majority will not appreciate you telling them that what they are doing is wrong. And secondly, don't think it's all right to live so close to the world that your children will marry into it, whether that's your physical children or your spiritual children. Because if they do, you will be torn in two when Jesus comes back. Will you look to him, or will you think of those who don't know him? Very solemn warnings. So just to round off the story of Lot, at the end of 19, Abraham sees the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We are told that God drove Lot out of Sodom for Abraham's sake. And in the next verse, we discover that Lot finally obeys the Lord and leaves Zoar and heads for the mountains. But he's unprepared. He's so unprepared that these daughters have to make him drunk so they can have children. And those children are Moab, the father of the Moabites, and Ben-Ammi, the father of the Ammonites. And in Deuteronomy 2:19, Moses is told to leave the Ammonites in peace. So, I want us to go back to 2 Peter and think what we said there. Right? Lot was oppressed by the conduct of unprincipled men. His righteous soul was tormented day after day with their deeds. And Peter says, look, if God can rescue Lot, he can rescue you from temptation. And he'll make sure the unrighteous are judged on the day of judgment. That reminds me very much of this passage from 1 Corinthians 3, verses 11 to 15. This isn't the whole bit, but I'm sure you know it. It starts, for no other foundation can anyone lay that which is laid with Christ Jesus. Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. If anyone's work which is built on it endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. You know, I think we don't pay enough attention to warnings like this in Scripture. Is it just enough to get into heaven, to be with God in eternity? Or will we be missing out on something if what we've done is built flimsily, is built of wood, hay, straw, stubble? Shouldn't we be people wanting to build with the things that will come through that fire? And what is said here, you know, reminds me of what Job said. I think it's slightly out of context, but in 19 verse 20, he said, I have escaped by the skin of my teeth. Is it possible that some believers will be like Lot and escape the destruction, not because they're looking forward to being released from it, but because God is merciful to them? I think that's food for thought. So I want to wrap this up with repeating my 5 warnings from Lot's poor example. I want to encourage us to seek to walk with God, not with other people. If the Lord provides you a way out of a situation that isn't good, I want you to encourage you to take it. I want to encourage you not to become settled in a sinful society. And that can not just be the world. Today, Philip mentioned early on Babylon, a lot of our institutional churches are embracing sin. So don't become settled. If that's where you are at the moment, don't be settled in them. Don't think it's all right to live too close to the world. You may leave children behind. And I certainly want to encourage you not to be content to escape by the skin of your teeth. And as I was preparing this, I saw very close parallels between Lot and Samson. Samson ended up doing something for God, but if he'd have been wiser during his life, he might have done so much more, but he wasn't. So I hope I've given you plenty to chew on. I'm going to stop screen sharing.